So the next module we're going to talk about is explore a little bit more, dive a little deeper here on what is trauma. And as Chan mentioned, and as you'll notice from the materials, that we are funded by SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. That's the only time I'm going to say it that way. And we utilize, and we work from their definition of trauma. And the way I remember it, and the way it's sort of a little trick for your brain, is to think about the 3 E's, or as someone said in the last training, 3 cubed. E cubed. Okay, the 3 E's. The event, the experience, and the effect. And if you remember that, you're going to remember most of what you need to remember about trauma and understanding trauma, because it's all 3. Many people are exposed to what you and I would say are traumatic events, but don't seem to have developed any trauma responses to it. They don't have any PTSD, they don't have any hypervigilance, any of those characteristics. For whatever reason, it didn't have the same effect on them that it may have on your siblings. Many people grow up in a household with siblings, and when you talk as adults, it's like you grew up in different houses. So the same thing happened, but you have completely different memories of it, and the impact it had on you also is very different. So trauma is very individualized, but at the heart of it is all 3 of these: the event, the experience, and the effect. I'm going to read the SAMHSA definition. You don't need to write it down, it's in your materials, but just so it's the larger definition is in your memory here. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So it can be event or events or circumstances that a person experiences as terrifying, and it has a long-lasting adverse effect on many dimensions of the person's life. So that's the definition we're using to define trauma. So this is going to be interesting to do this activity in the small room. So at each of your tables there are Post-it tablets and there are markers. And what I would like you to do is to brainstorm with your friends, and if you haven't met, introduce yourselves, and to write on an individual Post-it an example of a traumatic event or events. For example, one per Post-it, like rape, okay? I think that's something all of us would probably argue is a traumatic event. And just go through, brainstorm. There's no set number, but the more the merrier, as many as you could come up with. And take about 5 minutes, and someone could be the recorder and start writing that down. I think if you look at the 8 pages over here, how many examples of traumatic events you were able to come up with in a very short period of time. And while there are some duplications, there's a lot of unique ones here in terms of unique to your group. And I think that for illustration purposes, someone at your table believes, at one of the tables, believes every one of these events could be a traumatic event. And so, in other words, there are so many events that happen in people's lives, whether it's a single event or whether it's a continuity of events. And we've got spouse in the military combat, being arrested, financial abuse, sexual abuse, trafficking, a lot of loss, death, divorce, abandonment, job loss, physical abuse in terms of anything from assaults to bullying to rape, forced abortion, domestic violence. And these 2 I want to just talk about briefly a little bit more in detail, because the community traumas are the ones that really affect people they can affect them in a vicarious way. It doesn't necessarily have to have had a direct impact on them. And one of the, I'll give you one example, and maybe this has unfortunately happened in your work community, is there's a very high rate of suicide among criminal justice professionals, say correctional officers, probation officers, police officers. That may not have been someone you know directly, but it certainly has an impact on the community that, in a way, people seem to know, and can really have very detrimental effects on people, even though they didn't experience it directly themselves. It wasn't their partner, or wasn't someone, their direct supervisor or supervisee. And other kinds, like natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, all of those are experienced by people, maybe to more or lesser degree depending upon their proximity to it, but can have an impact, such as 9/11. You know, the proximity that people had to the Twin Towers probably had a greater impact on them than people who were further away. But someone may have been living in California and their daughter worked in the Twin Towers and they couldn't get a hold of them. During the Boston Marathon bombing, my son was there, not running, he was there, and I couldn't get a hold of him because the cell phone services were all shut down. So though I wasn't there, I was actually at a meeting in Ohio, but I knew he was there and I wondered if he was okay. So I didn't have to be there, in other words, to have this sense of helplessness and fear that something had happened to my child. So community trauma is really poverty. I would even put that down here to some. It could be either community or historical trauma. And these are the kinds of traumas that really, knowing your community well, are important. If you have refugees, if you have immigrants, if you have a large problem with people who are experiencing homelessness, that would be a really important part of the community to understand and read maybe a little bit more about what impact that can have on people. Being in foster care certainly affects people. That's a warning sign. We know that's a red flag for people in terms of trauma. So really familiarizing yourself and being very conversant on the ranges of traumatic experiences that people have is really important. Did you have something? I thought I saw a hand in the back. Nope, okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next, well, actually, now I'm stuck here. Okay. Just making sure that we covered all of these up here. Physical abuse, certainly all of you came up with examples. Sexual abuse, witnessing violence, historical trauma, combat, natural disasters. We added a few of our own, and I think all of you did a great job of covering all of those. Just making sure that we give plenty of examples that are meaningful for everybody that's in the group.
So the impact of having been both of those, all of those, it can be poly.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, poly.
Many people who have when you start pulling the onion skin back, you realize many people have multiple events, multiple traumatic events, yes.
Can I just ask what you mean by historical trauma?
Can I give you an example?
Can you tell me, like?
It's a historical trauma is an event or events that have happened to, for example, a population of people where maybe their offspring have not themselves experienced, but the impact of that on the people who did experience are carried forward in the way they live their lives, the way they see the world, whether they see the world as a dangerous place or a place that's safe or a place that's out to get them. So it wouldn't necessarily be the individual's experience, but what's taught to them. American Indians have experienced a lot of historical trauma, and those stories have been told to the children and how they feel about the government, for example, or how they feel about the schools, or whether they can trust the schools.
I would say even African Americans.
Absolutely, yeah. The history of slavery has had an impact.
People who are related to Holocaust survivors.
Early recent immigrants,
Yeah.
you know, it's something that they pass on to
Right.
children.
And their if you think about how that changes their relationship to others and to the world and to the institutions like the education institutions, that's what we mean by historical trauma.
I'm originally from Poland, so you can still hear older generations, but the beliefs are being passed on even to younger generations. As you guys know, the Second World War.
Would that be the idea of intergenerational trauma?
Yes.
Okay, so it's the same thing.
The same thing.
Okay.
And it many times is even built into our institutional response to people as well, to people who have experienced historical or intergenerational trauma. If poverty, as an example, would be intergenerational and historical trauma. And think of the way that we hear people speak about people who are poor. It's very disparaging. You know, it's often in a way of why can't they just get it together and, you know. pull themselves up from the bootstraps, and these very disparaging comments of people who have lived maybe in generation after generation in poverty. And many of our policies reinforce those views as well. So I think that's really about educating ourselves in terms of the communities where we're working so that we're sensitive to that.
I think there's even some of this historical trauma in the criminal justice system in that I've had conversations with police officers where they talk about trying to work against their assumptions that children of incarcerated folks are guilty by association, and so that they just say, even just knowing that kid is the son of so-and-so, I automatically assume that
Right.
translates.
And that being aware of it, of course, is important, because that to deny that one is behaving that way would just certainly perpetuate it. So it's really, it's living in New York State, my first experience with really getting historical trauma, getting it, like really getting it, was I grew up in Ohio, small town, maybe there were 10 Jewish families in the entire community, seriously. I mean, there was very, very, very Catholic and Protestant community. I moved to Albany, New York. And New York has a very large Jewish population, as does the city of Albany. And I joined the Jewish Community Center because they had a swimming pool, and I swam for fitness. There was no other indoor pool that I could gain access to. So I'm in the ladies' locker room, changing to go swim, and without giving you too much information, I'm standing next to a much older woman than I was probably 29 at the time, and I just glanced over at her, and she had a number tattooed on her arm. That was my first personal recognition and understanding of that impact, that what this woman had survived to be standing there in Albany, New York, at the Jewish Community Center swimming. And I could have read about it in history books, I did, all through, you hear this through your history lessons throughout grammar school and college, but to see a woman who had that experience and survived, brought it to a different level with me. I didn't know her, but I saw the tattoo on her arm. So that's when I got it. I really got that really happened, and it happened to real people, and it had a consequence. So I think it's knowing the community where you are is really important. Yeah.
Well, and it sounds like too that there's ways in which historical trauma doesn't just live in history.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, and it seems like that's an important distinction, that historical trauma lives with people currently because we still live in a racist society.
Right.
The government still doesn't always treat certain groups equally, and so it seems like that's a...
Understanding the history, I think exactly what you're saying, and it moves forward. And some of the institutional barriers that we just brought forward with us, over the years, and everybody doesn't fit neatly into being able to confront those barriers.
I think one of the impact is also not only how society, but how we see ourselves in the world. The worldview that we have, I'm first generation. So a lot of those traumas were very present for me, from language to not fitting in to, living in an impoverished community. So it's how we see the world.
And I think that's also the foundation for a lot of discussion around microaggressions, the way we are in our workplace, the assumptions we make about people who we work with, whether in the justice system or the behavioral health system, that sort of those core beliefs we go in with that may inadvertently lead us to say things or behave in a way or react in a way that is really foundational. It's part of the way in which our society is structured and our institutions are structured. So that sensitivity to that it's very important. Okay, go ahead. One last comment, I'll move on.
Well, speaking of that, I know we've got a mixed group of criminal justice and social service professionals in here, and we really do speak different languages. We will say things as criminal justice involve people that will horrify people in the social service setting, but it's the perspective from which we come, and that also leads to some of those assumptions.
Absolutely, and also leads to making blending, collaborating very difficult. Coming up with a shared language is a challenge. I had to ask somebody what an abbreviation was. It was. At both of your professions, all of your professions have lots of abbreviations. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The next video we're going to see, and you can see right here on the slide, it says activity pack number 6. We're gonna hear from 2 officers, including Officer Morales. You can read if you want to. And Officer Tully. What's really important about both of these officers who talked to us about a traumatic event that they experienced is that they express a lot of guilt about what they experienced in their response. So when doing the training and talking with a group of people, avoiding saying, well, they didn't follow procedure. This isn't about procedure. This is about what happened on the job to two people. Because that's something that's a safe conversation to have is, well, if the officer had just stepped back 4 steps, this would have, that isn't a productive conversation. This is really about what happened on the job and how what their experiences were and what impact it had on them as professionals. So just as sort of keeping that as an introduction or context for this. Okay. What I'd like to do now is brainstorm as a group about how Officers Morales and Tully described the experience that they had and what stuck out with you, and then the effect that it had. Let's talk first about the experience part of that, because we described the event. They each described the event that happened in detail. But what stuck out with you in terms of how they experienced it?
How fast it happened.
Okay. Looks like actually have it. Where's that? Seconds, right?
Unplanned.
The self-blame.
That's a little bit of an effect, but yeah, we'll put it there.
Both of them describe very unique details about maybe the person's face or eyes, very unique details.
A lot of detail, but what I always find interesting too is there's some amnesia there too. You know, it's that both are happening. And in terms of fast, it's also then described as though it took forever, right? So time is a really big factor. So to ask someone to recall accurately when something happened or how long it took really is probably outside of the scope of their capacity when they are experiencing a trauma. And that also often becomes a real stickling point in criminal events. Like, when did it happen? How long did it take? But when someone has that overload of that all those, you know, the cortisol sweeping over their brain, you're thinking about self-preservation here. Not, oh my gosh, was that 10:04 or was that 10:07? So time really has both ends of the spectrum, which I think is really interesting. And in the justice system, that seems to be a big deal. What else? What other experiences?
It's very like multi-sensory. I heard this click or I smelled this. I mean, I guess that goes with detail, but it was also just experienced at your core senses.
Yeah.
Like a sense of disbelief.
Let's not move, if you think of some others, that's fine, but let's talk about then the effect. What words did you hear, the impact that this event had on either or each of them?
Kind of going back to the time, almost in a continuum, when she said the time perspective on her event, it's different than anybody else was experiencing it. Especially the first officer, she had said that, you know, she thought she was fine, but she hears her voice wavering and she kind of is re-experiencing it in a way. It's not as if it happened 6 years ago, it's just happened again, you know, so
That's
again, the time perspective there.
The re-experiencing puts people back in the present. And re-experiencing, we know, is one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, right? So that is something which we
And
know.
kind of with that is the perceived threat where there is no threat.
Yeah. So there's really,
Yeah.
and that leads to all sorts of things, right? There's hypervigilance.
The perception of danger changes.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point because you said perception of threat when there is no threat. I kind of see it as like maybe the reality that there really are threats out there that were not perceived before because because the police officer, she probably wasn't expecting that to happen because it never happened to her before, but she's been trained to not let people close that gap. And so it's more of maybe a reality that these things can and will happen.
And that leads to what?
Self-blame.
Self-blame, loss of control, trust issues, lots of trust issues. There's lots of self-blame. That's what I always say when I'm processing this. You don't need heap blame on them. They're taking care of that themselves. You know, that's, and it's also true with, if you think of Stephanie, the woman, the woman whose mother was she witnessed being, she felt that she had those feelings about herself, didn't she? About when she allowed herself to be a victim of domestic violence.
There's guilt there too.
A lot of guilt. Yep.
I think that your perception of your ability to handle the next situation changes. So maybe previously you believed that you know, you can handle the danger, and then the danger happens, and then your perception of your coping skills goes to you know, I'm somewhat powerful to I'm powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So now
Powerlessness is a real issue.
Now everything is the danger.
Yeah. And as Officer Morales talked about, it transferred to how she responded to her child.
Right.
A lot of hypervigilance around her child. Yeah, and relationships. So those are all descriptions about what impact it had. Officer Tully talked about not being able to run. She couldn't mow the lawn.
She also mentioned, you know, cognitive memory, concentration, nightmares, flashbacks, sleeping problems.
Sleep, right? A lot of sleep problems. Think about this now for a minute. If you are a probation officer or a case manager, and your probationers or people you're supervising are late for appointments all the time, and what your response is. It may have been all they could do to gather themselves to get on the bus that day to come. And then the first greeting is, you're late. Versus, glad you got here, that's great. You know, and so that's how many of you have ever forgotten an appointment before? Okay, and probably because there was so much going on in your day, in your mind, in your brain, that just didn't rise to the level that you were going to remember it. So when you have, when your brain is on stress overload, you pick out, you know, what it is that you have to do, and safety is at the top of the list. And so when we talk about trauma-informed responses, it's thinking about this. Someone can't make an early appointment because they don't sleep.
What happened versus what's wrong.
Yeah. What happened to you? So for people who, I mean, where you can offer a choice, don't have an 8 o'clock appointment for somebody who has really just disrupted sleep or is taking sleep medication that makes it really hard for them to get their everything in order first thing. So it's really thinking about what both Officer Morales and Officer Tully described, what happened to them, the impact it had on them, and it really disordered their lives in very fundamental ways. In very fundamental ways. Things that you would ordinarily do in your day without thinking about it, mowing the lawn, going to the grocery, drinking coffee in the morning, watching television. So and it's also important to keep in mind as planners in terms of, you know, how you work with people in the justice system, not Tigger's, Triggers. That was the name of one of my cats. And no, I'm not going to bounce across the room. So what kind of triggers people have, and it can be anything. It doesn't have to make sense to us. It does not have to make sense to us, whether or not it's a trigger. It's whether it is or not. Yes?
I just have, I guess, a process question about that. When you do this training with officers, I'm just thinking about some of the visuals in that video, the bullet wounds and such. Do you give sort of a trigger warning, if you will, before you show that? I mean, just knowing what people's experiences might be.
I do that at the beginning.
Okay.
And I think more, if you know that there are people in your audience who might be especially affected by certain videos, absolutely saying, you know, Officer Tully and Officer Morales are going to talk about being injured on the job. And I think that that's fair. Absolutely. If you think if you're talking with a group of people who you think will be especially triggered by that, or maybe by some of the other videos, it's important to give that reminder again. You can, and we've actually removed a couple of videos that were especially difficult, that were in the older versions of the training. You could actually hear the cameraman gasp in one place. So we don't include that one anymore. So just as a way of bringing it back to what the definition of trauma is. So it is an event or a series of events or circumstances. The experiences that the person has are uniquely their own. You know, it's whether it's the sense of powerlessness or whatever, and the effect that it has on them is, it's part of who they are now. Officer Tully talked about being shattered. And you can have your life, but you have to put it back together in a different way. You'll never be that person you were before. That's the difference between a crisis and a trauma. A crisis, you are broken apart, you put yourself back together. A trauma, it shatters you. And I think if you picture that word, you're shattered. I think that's a really good description of it. So traumatic events can be any series of events. It can be a chronic, such as living in poverty, experiencing homelessness, and the person experiences it as overwhelming. Overwhelming. And it affects every corner of their life, as described by both Officer Tully and Officer Morales. And I would suggest this is also the case with people who you supervise or people who you see in treatment. And it may be that they simply can't do the thing that's expected of them because it is so triggering for them. A psychiatrist who we do work with in New York City gave an example of a man that they were supervising who had done some pretty serious offenses, and he was unable to go to treatment. He kept missing his appointments. He wanted to be engaged in treatment. He said all the right things. When the appointments were made, he didn't show up. As it turns out, his brother was murdered at the corner, at the intersection where the treatment provider was located. And it took a while to get there, but that was why he couldn't come to treatment. He wasn't being treatment resisting, as we sometimes imagine our clients are. It was he just simply couldn't literally go to that intersection. So they found someplace else for him to get treatment. So sometimes it requires really digging deeply to find out what it is that's triggering someone that interferes with their ability to get on with, whether it's their conditions in the justice system or getting on with their life.
And also remembering that, one of the coping skills, I think one of the officers mentioned it, was safety also meant avoidance.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because it keeps you safe in the bubble if you don't go out of the bubble.
And so people who don't want to leave their home, the safety of their home, or maybe a little bit bigger, their neighborhood, absolutely. And that's important to keep in mind. Safety is the top priority. Self-preservation is the top priority here. And it may be really disruptive to our work that they are not keeping appointments or not being forthcoming, but safety is what's at the heart of someone who has a trauma experience. You really can't do a lot of trauma work therapeutically with someone who doesn't feel safe, and safe in all ways. When something is a trauma, and both officers talked about this, it changes the way they see the world. They talked about trust, they talked about safety, the hypervigilance. It changes, what's that?
Power and control.
Power and control, and Officer Brown's talking about didn't want to be a victim. That word. Didn't want to be a victim because that brings with it a whole lot of other expectations and roles. So to summarize what trauma is, and I think all of the exercises and the videos are really clear that it's the 3 E's, we talked about that. It isn't necessarily one thing that happened to someone. It could have happened in the past or the present. Many people who come into the justice system, it's all of these. Okay, it's all of these. We may see the one thing that happened, maybe that injured them, that brought them into, say, to medical care, but that doesn't discount what might be ongoing. And it's pervasive, and we'll get to this a little bit more in Module 4, but how people respond, the impact it has is very, very individualized. And yeah.
I just like to, with a lot of our clients, what I see is that they may have a traumatic event that happened recently, but like you said before, the whole peeling of the onion. This comes from early childhood unresolved trauma, and now we have another type of trauma that is now, triggered.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in the next, to take that a little bit further in the next module too, that when you take something away from someone, a coping mechanism, you gotta put something in its place. If someone has survived to this point in their life by fighting, by beating people up, by provocative violence, by using substances, by drinking, by avoidance, and you take that away by addressing their trauma, something's gotta be there. Because you can't just take something away from someone that's been so really has been their safety. You have to put something back in its place. And that's really where trauma-informed systems come in, and also certainly trauma treatment, trauma-specific treatment comes into play there.